In the mid-90s, it seemed that the horror genre was once again in jeopardy. That seems to be the trend with the genre. Every decade, horror kind of dies down for a little, until one film comes along and reinvents the whole thing. Like Dr. Frankenstein instilling new life into his monster.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
There was a period of time where the studios were trying to breathe new life into their 80s franchises, and one way or another, these fresh new attempts at reinvigorating said franchises weren't entirely successful. With Jason Goes to Hell, you had Jason's spirit jumping in and out of different human bodies every 5 minutes, a far departure from the tried-and-true formula of the Paramount Friday the 13th films. You had Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which, while a critical and commercial success, definitely took the Nightmare on Elm Street series in a different direction. It's hard to even call that one a sequel because it spends so much time self-referencing itself. You also had a slew of direct-to-video cash-ins. Hellraiser and Leprechaun were prime examples of this. For decades, Wes Craven had been scaring the holy crap out of us with imaginative thrillers like Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, and of course the original Nightmare on Elm Street. But then he kind of hid in the shadows for a while. Of course, there was the occasional made-for-TV movie, and he also directed The People Under the Stairs, which, while I remember it coming out, I don't think it had a really big following. Then came Scream. It's funny because I don't remember a lot of advertising for this movie. A lot of what I heard came from people who had actually gone to see it. At that point, I was more of a Star Wars geek anyway, so I slowly started to lose interest in horror. But if only I knew what slasher master Wes Craven had up his sleeves, I would have gone to see it much sooner. Keep in mind, for today's generation, Scream isn't anything special, only because there have been so many teen horror movies since then, and many of them parodies. The first one I can remember was I Know What You Did Last Summer, which came out exactly 1 year later. I remember expressly watching that and just thinking what a terrible knockoff it was. Watching it recently, I was pained to discover it no longer had the effect it had when I first saw it in 1996. But then I remembered just what it had meant to me and why it was so effective. It does so many things right. The story is about a stalker who goes around prank-calling a bunch of teenagers before brutally slashing them apart. The opening scene sets the tone for the rest of the film flawlessly. Drew Barrymore plays Casey, who becomes the killer's first victim. It starts off as an innocent phone call where this deep voice on the other end claims to have dialed the wrong number, until he calls her again and again. After she hangs up on him a few times, the killer reveals his true colors and tells her the only way he'll let her live is if they play a game of movie trivia. The first funny part here is when they have a simple conversation about scary movies.
What's your favorite scary movie?
What's yours?
Guess.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Is that the one where the guy had knives for fingers?
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
Freddy, that's right. I like that movie. It was scary.
Well, the first one was, but the rest sucked.
So...
It's a delightful nod to Craven's original masterpiece, but at the same time it bitch-slaps the rest of the Freddy series. Then there are the actual trivia questions. The first one she gets right away, but it's the question about Friday the 13th that she flubs on.
Name the killer in Friday the 13th.
Jason! Jason! Jason!
I'm sorry. That's the wrong answer.
No, it's not! No, it's not! It was Jason!
Afraid not? No way.
Listen, it was Jason! I saw that movie 20 goddamn times!
Then you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel.
This is funny because so many people think that Jason is the killer throughout the entire series. It's a common mistake, kind of like how people sometimes refer to Frankenstein's monster as Frankenstein.
You tricked me.
So after she gets the questions wrong, the scene just gets more intense until the killer finally strikes. What we end up with is an extremely gruesome murder scene that is made even more powerful when Casey's parents come home and find their daughter hanging, gutted from a tree. Now that's the way you start an awesome horror movie. This whole setup would become the cliche of the rest of the series, but when this happened for the first time, it was heart-pounding and suspenseful. Oddly enough, this is probably the most graphic part of the whole movie. The main character is a girl named Sidney Prescott, played by a young Neve Campbell, whose mother was brutally murdered the year before. Covering the story was snotty news reporter Gail Weathers, played by Friends superstar Courtney Cox, who has reappeared to cover the double murder of Casey and her boyfriend Stephen. There's a charming yet inexperienced cop, Deputy Dewey Riley, played by David Arquette, who does everything in his power to help solve the crime while falling for Gail. Then there's Sidney's group of friends. Most of them were relative unknowns back then, but they all went on to become big stars. Matthew Lillard plays the goofy, off-the-wall Stu. Rose McGowan plays Tatum, Sidney's witty, spunky best friend, and Skeet Ulrich plays the hard-to-read, kind of creepy boyfriend Billy Loomis. My favorite character by far is Randy, played by Jamie Kennedy.
Did you really put her liver in the mailbox? Because I heard that they found her liver in the mailbox next to her spleen and her pancreas.
He's the movie buff of the film, and he is the one who devises all these rules to successfully surviving a horror film.
Number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no!
As the films went on, his updated list of rules became more exaggerated, but his rants are always fun to listen to.
If they watch prom night, they'd save time. There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect.
The best thing about the film is how it keeps us all guessing who the killer might be. There was a feeling right from the start that this was a flesh and blood killer, and we just knew it had to be one of the supporting characters. Wes Craven balances this near perfectly, giving each character these little subtle moments where it could possibly be any of them, but we're never quite sure.
Casey and Steve were completely hollowed out. And the fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
Or a man's mentality.
When the film finally reveals who the killer is, we're all slapping our heads saying, of course. But watching it for the first time with a fresh slate, there really was no clear indication. This may be saying too much, but there are several times where the film comes a little too close to revealing the killer's identity, but if anything, it does a good job of throwing us off track. I love all the subtle nods this movie makes to other horror films. There's a scene where we see a janitor dressed up in a fedora hat and striped sweater.
Not your friend.
Randy references several horror films throughout the movie, and during the climax, the characters are all gathered around watching John Carpenter's Halloween.
You're starting to sound like some Wes Carpenter flick or something.
The bottom line is, Scream knows exactly what kind of movie it's trying to be, and it constantly pokes fun at itself by referencing the genre. Billy and Sidney even used the MPAA rating system as a parallel to their own relationship.
Well, 2 years ago, we started off hot and heavy. Nice solid R rating on our way to an NC-17.
By the time it's all over, it ties up all the loose ends beautifully. Remember, most horror movies don't put a lot of emphasis on character development and plot. Good horror movies have these intact, but it's rarely done well. After all, the main purpose of a horror movie is to scare people. But this one scares people and tells a fantastic story, which led to there being a trilogy, and that rarely happens, if ever, in the horror field. I've got to say I hold this one in high regard. The performances are top-notch, it balances suspense with a satisfying amount of gore, not that the gore is that important when you have a good story, and it has a lot of things for watchful horror fans to look out for. It also makes me look at horror in a new light. I've always said what a problem I've had with the original Halloween, that it looks synthetic and it's not as effective because there's very little gore. But that's also because I've been desensitized by gory movies all my life. If you spent your childhood watching Freddy and Jason and then in your teenage years you finally pop in Halloween, it would seem kind of unimpressive. I've watched Scream numerous times in the last decade, and over time the effect wore off. But when I stopped to think how it impacted me back in 1996 before all of these sequels and rehashes came along, then I began to appreciate it again. And that's how I understand why people hold Halloween and films like it in such high regard. It's that initial viewing that keeps us watching these movies years down the road, long after that magic has worn off. Don't take it from me, a lot of people still consider this just another teeny bopper flick, but it was helmed by the same guy who created Freddy Krueger. It's the one, the original, folks. This one's pretty hard to beat.